Before I get into the meat and potatoes of this video, I want to say that I am going to talk a lot about Aikido in this video, but I'm not really referring to Aikido in terms of philosophy or history so much as I am Aikido, the technical curriculum. I'm making that distinction because a lot of systems in Japan, China, and even some in Europe have the very same techniques in them. It's just that Aikido is a shorthand that the internet generally understands. Not to mention, all these systems tend to run into pretty similar issues. I've also decided to use the word this way in hopes of avoiding some of the ideological nonsense that often comes with either loving or hating the art as an overall practice. Personally, I don't really care how or why people train it, nor do I care about people's personal philosophies. But what does bother me are some of the very weak arguments that follow this art around like flies on poop. There are a lot of people out there who like to present their opinions as objective and definitive without so much as a source or even a well-written anecdote. It's a lot of appeals to authority, appeals to tradition, familiarity biases. These are all rhetorical deficiencies that most high schoolers should at least be aware of, yet they are all over the place when it comes to Aikido. I'm not going to spend this video picking these positions apart because there really isn't anything to them. They are hollow. A lot of stuff on Aikido, especially from the pro Aikido side, is all about how there is a singular, specific, authentic, correct way to approach the art, and I find this to be just as droll as the people who make sweeping judgments about the art without ever really having experienced it in any sort of depth. My hope is to sidestep as much of all this as possible today. If you watch my channel, I think my opinion is fairly transparent, just so it's on record. I think martial arts are subjective, i.e., there is no definitive way to practice. I know for a fact, historically, that discontinuity is at least as commonplace as preservation, even in East Asia, and I think Aikido is in a pretty bad place, just not as bad a place as is popularly claimed. Instead of retreading old material that I've already posted about on my channel, I want to talk about the techniques of Aikido, their shortcomings, and how maybe we've even been mistreating them for the better part of almost a century and a half. There is this piece of mythology that follows the techniques popular in Aikido around. That is that they are just too dangerous to practice live. This is one of those statements where there is just enough truth to it that it never quite goes away. I believe this line of thinking probably originated when Kano removed a ton of small joint locks and similar stuff from the judo curriculum. In his eyes, these were indeed too dangerous for live practice. We know this from his own memoirs. Now, personally, I don't think Kano was a moron. Dude was highly educated and very involved in the jiu-jitsu world. It is also plausible that at that time, these techniques were actually pretty dangerous, but I'm gonna come back to that idea in a minute, so hold on to it. Is there any truth to this idea today? Sort of. The fact of the matter is that injuries do occur from these kinds of locks, standing joint locks in particular. I'm going to show a few on screen, and if you are squeamish at all, then close your eyes for a few seconds, because I'm squeamish and some of these clips really make my palms sweat. The reality is that these kinds of locks do organically come up now and then, and they do seem to disproportionately lead to injury. Now, at the end of the day, these kinds of things do not happen that often. Even in formats like BJJ today, they are so-called low percentile techniques. A question worth speculating on, though, was were they always this way? If Kano removed them right out of the gate, it does seem to suggest, at least, that people might have been much better about using them back in his day, but it's also hard to know for sure. Koryu Jiu-Jitsu records are tough to access, and even if you can get your hands on some, they are even tougher to decode. A lot of techniques have flowery names purposefully to disguise them from the uninitiated view. Plus, I wouldn't just be looking for techniques either, but looking for practitioners with verifiable bouts who allegedly specialized in small joint locks. So that is a lot of ifs that would have to come back affirmative for us to even begin confirming the idea that people were better at these techniques back then. Of course, there is also the flip side of that suggestion. Maybe everybody was just worse and therefore much more susceptible to small joint manipulations. It is certainly true that athletes have been getting stronger and stronger over the generations, so there might be a bit of accuracy to this idea. Technically speaking, though, I don't think this is accurate for a reason I will get back to in the next part. For the sake of argument, let's just say this stuff all worked and was more or less just as consistent as everything else. For the record, I don't think that they were, but let's humor a bit of optimism for a moment. One of Kano's innovations was to give judo live sparring. Now, to be completely fair and historically accurate, some jiu-jitsu schools already did have live sparring. It's not like Kano invented the idea. From a pedagogical standpoint, though, his idea was that live resistance enhances technical proficiency. Smart, obviously. I don't think anyone would argue otherwise today. The issue here is that very little of the aikido-esque stuff made it into the judo curriculum. Well, it did later as Goshinwaza, but you still can't use any of that in live sessions. My point here is that while tons of techniques got further and further refined by increasingly skilled individuals over the course of a century and some change, these other techniques just languished and collected dust. They didn't see the same kind of innovation because people weren't incentivized to research them. Aikido itself eventually did come along, and it did successfully preserve the techniques. But consider this. The big judo events every year are Grand Slams, and every 4 years it's the Olympics. You train judo to win competitions, so you develop techniques to defeat resisting opponents. In Aikido, the big annual event is the All Japan Aikido demonstrations. Maybe you see where I'm going with this already. The ultimate venue for Aikido is a cooperative demonstration. As much appreciation, admiration, and even agreement that I have for very practically minded Aikido teachers, present and past, I think it was inevitable that Aikido evolved towards aesthetics over function. Why? Because students were, frankly, incentivized to do so. The big public venue where you show off your stuff is essentially an aesthetic showcase with a martial theme. It is not competitive in nature. Now, to be perfectly clear, I think it is totally fine to train for aesthetics if you're being honest about doing so. I think martial arts, as I mentioned before, are subjective experiences. The only reason to do martial arts is to win and harm people and defend yourself position is something an immature, edgy teenage version of myself would come up with. As long as you're getting value out of what you're doing, I don't think any reason for training is better or worse than the other. It's perfectly fine to do competitions, but I think it's silly to believe that's the only reason to be doing martial arts. That being said, I do not believe it takes a super smart person to put together that you get better at the thing that you train for. If that is competition, then you're going to get better at competition. If it's demonstration, it's demonstration. And yes, I know self-defense is somewhere in that mix too, but I also think a lot of people kind of fool themselves into thinking that's what they're training for, when really they're training for competition or demonstration. So the question we are kind of left with here is this. Is this a pedagogical problem or a technical problem? Have we been training wrong in terms of martial goals for a century, or do the techniques themselves just suck? The answer to the question I just posed is that it's frustratingly complicated. I could sit here and pontificate at you about some hypothetical timeline where none of this stuff got banned from judo. My instincts tell me that you probably would see effective small joint manipulation more frequently, just not as much as more fundamental takedowns like a single leg or foot reaps or hip throws. The bitter truth, though, is that it's just all speculation. I don't know what 100 years of small joint lock practice in live sessions would look like. Maybe it's the exact same thing as right now. What I can tell you about unequivocally is that these techniques do have pretty serious limitations. The first issue that I think a lot of people fail to understand is that small joint locks, especially in a standing position, must come on fast. You either have them or you do not. I know a lot of BJJ folks who think wrist locks are a very dick move. Officially, my position on this is
a cage. I read about did you say want?
But more articulately speaking, they have to snap on because they are absurdly easy to defend against. Your window for applying them is very small, and usually, once people have an inkling that something is up, you lose your chance almost instantly. These are not like arm bars where you can slowly ramp them up, and yes, this is also why they tend to cause injury. Locks like these are kind of all or nothing. They snap on or you lose them. There isn't much of a middle ground where the person can consciously decide whether or not they want to tap. The other problem, and the real problem in my view, is that defending against these things is easy. Consider that you might be really good at some hip throw or a single leg or something like that. Although the element of surprise is always welcome, sometimes people are just so skillful at these kinds of techniques that they can be like, yeah, whatever, I know you see it coming, but I'm still gonna get you with it. And then they actually manage to pull that off. Small joint locks are not like this. The overwhelming majority of the time, you will fail to force these things to happen if you enter into a struggle phase. But the real kicker to me is that the defense to almost every wrist lock and every elbow lock is, at least in the standing position, this. It's the classic, fundamental, basic bitch grappling position. Arms tucked, no gaps between the torso and the elbows. Literally, the defense is to just be a weak 2 grappler with a shred of confidence in your stance. Literally, everyone does this. Everyone knows how to do this. It is super fundamental crap. Likewise, it's pretty tough to get much going on someone who has your lapel and is stiff-arming the living daylights out of you, especially if you reach over to fiddle with their hand because you've just given them a huge cue in neon lights to resist you with everything they have while you're jerking around with their hand. And these are things you do not have to take my word for. These are testable realities right now. Unless you are significantly stronger than the other person that you're working with, it does not take much to just T-Rex arms your small joint lock shenanigans away. By all means, feel free to go play with this at your dojo or gym or wherever. The next question is, naturally, is there a way to overcome these deficiencies? My answer is sure, kind of. But we need more eyes on this stuff, more minds coming up with stuff, and people actually serious about pushing it all forward. Right now, we just don't have that. Most internet people have decided these are, on a good day, unreliable techniques not worth the time. Even within Aikido, the majority of people don't really care about making this stuff more martial, probably because to do so would require expanding the curriculum, something I've discussed before on the channel. If you told me that only 100 people in the whole United States were interested in making this stuff truly martial and actively trying to, I would believe you. I think it's a very fringe faction of us that are actually interested in any of this, interested in pushing the Aikido curriculum into a more martial space. You're probably not too interested in any of that, though. I said it's sort of possible to defeat the comically simple defenses to these techniques. How? The best successes I've had come from honestly identifying the weaknesses of the techniques themselves. The biggest weakness is that a tucked elbow kills 90% of the curriculum. If you look at most Aikido techniques, the defining feature that runs through a huge majority of the corpus is that the arm that is being attacked must have its elbow extended away from the body. The farther away, the better in most cases. There are a few techniques that defy this. Iriminage comes to mind, but for the most part, this is the first major problem that we must deal with. In my experience, so far, I've come up with 2 ways to pull this off, to pull that elbow away from the torso consistently, and I've stolen them from other martial arts, as you would guess. First, get the other person to put their hands onto the mat. Collar drags, snap downs, harassing foot sweeps. I don't care how you do it. I use lots of different methods. You have to get the arm you plan to attack to post. An arm posted on the mat is one that isn't tucked against the torso, unless that person decides to turtle, at which point you're better off doing something else anyway. The second way that I've managed to achieve this, and the one that I think more people will be more interested in, is the Russian 2-on-1. I've seen this suggestion crop up organically around the internet, but I think it remains broadly untested. The truth, though, is that this position outside of a person's arm, with chest contact on the shoulder, is like the most fertile ground for Aikido shit to happen. Almost every technique in the whole system is at least theoretically available from the Russian 2-on-1 position. How you get here is, again, kind of up to you. This isn't really an instructional. Collar drags, arm drags, duck unders, whatever you want, it's all valid. I will point out, though, that getting to this position in the gi can be very difficult. The upside to that, though, is that once you do actually get there, it's also pretty easy to keep the person pinned down. It's difficult to escape because of the material. The benefit of the Russian tie is that your arm is between your opponent's arm and his torso. This creates space for a lot of Aikido things to happen. Now, I also do some other gimmicky things. If you get an underhook, for example, then push the person's face away, their arm basically unwinds into an ikkyo a lot of the time. Another example is that I do like to apply Nikkyo with the lapel of my own gi. Usually this only works once on a person, though. I've also had some limited success with certain entries that are similar to Kataguruma entries in modern judo. Regardless of how you choose to go about it, I think the features, the weaknesses in specific of these techniques will always remain roughly the same. If your opponent manages to stiff arm or tuck their arm completely to their torso, your technique is dead. If you get into a struggle phase that is not in the Russian 2-on-1 position, your technique is dead. If your opponent can read your intentions before you act, your technique is dead. What people who want to make this stuff work need to spend time on, in my opinion, is finding positions to negate as many of these problems as possible before launching attacks. This should sound familiar because it's that old position before submission adage. We also need to be looking at how to set things up and how to use subterfuge, how to disguise our intentions. Something all these joint locking styles do very poorly is just practice techniques in a vacuum. Fiddling around with wrists is a lot easier when you have your opponent worried about all the foot sweeps you just attempted. I know the Aikido people will bring up strikes, but come on, the strikes built into the curriculum just kinda suck. I'm very down for an interpretation of Aikido as a supplement to dirty boxing, or to something like the Muay Thai clinch, but most strikers would rightfully scoff at what the system has going on at the moment. This is why I think a martial Aikido needs an expanded curriculum. It's so much easier to hide your aims when the other person is worried about getting swept, or leg kicked, or genuinely liver punched. The premise of subterfuge exists within Aikido, but it is extremely underdeveloped because, again, it's never needed to be all that developed. Plus, if you consider joint locks in every culture they appear in, including Japanese culture, by the way, they always exist as part of a larger system. I don't think Aikido's idea to train these things specifically in isolation was bad on paper, in the same way that I don't think training pure ground game is bad on paper. But if you want to be as martial as you can possibly be, this stuff needs to be slotted back into a broader system. One last issue I do want to bring up here is one that I see around on YouTube, and full disclosure, I've totally been guilty of myself in the past, and this is getting tunnel vision on techniques. I think a lot of Aikido guys who are doing this stuff live, especially for the first time, will sometimes get a wrist and just latch onto that booger for dear life, trying to get whatever they're doing to work. Keep in mind that struggle faces are where this stuff goes to die. This is another thing Aikido does prepare you for on paper. In the art, we have what we call Henkawaza, which is just changing from one technique to another fluidly. Unfortunately, this stuff is usually like a post black belt requirement for some reason, when in my view this should be an intermediate level focus. I mentioned earlier that this art has a problem with training things in a vacuum, but consider that there are zero competitive martial arts out there that preach you'll get them on the first try, don't worry. Boxing hides those knockout punches deep into combinations. Wrestling does chain wrestling. Even in judo, throws right off the grip are far and away the exception to the rule. You've got to set up those big takedowns. All these arts use techniques to set up other techniques. Aikido people don't do this when they live spar, the ones that are live sparring at all. Probably because this isn't how they train, but if you want it to be martial, it's something that has to be overcome. When your technique is dead, don't keep trying to resuscitate it. It's dead. Move on to another technique, whether that be an Aikido technique, a judo technique, a strike. It doesn't matter, but don't just latch onto it like a dead fish. Keeping all of that in mind that I just mentioned, I do want to add one final twist to this overall discussion. As I've spent the last 4 or 5 years quietly experimenting on this stuff, I've grown to realize that sometimes we as martial artists fail to ask ourselves good, meaningful questions. One of those questions, to me, is what is Aikido for, martially speaking? What do I mean by this? Like, judo is for taking people down, and I guess pinning them sometimes. BJJ is pinning them sometimes, but mostly submitting people. Wrestling is kind of for taking people down and then pinning them. Boxing is all about the hand games and the power punches with the aim towards a knockout. What does Aikido achieve unique to itself that these other things just don't? If you are really cynical, I think the answer you might come up with is nothing. It doesn't do anything different. It's just worse at everything that everything else already achieves. Personally, I've come to 2 conclusions about these techniques in Aikido, and they aren't actually as cynical as you might imagine. The first is that, unlike most arts, the takedowns in Aikido are also the pin, which are also the submission. Despite everything, the end portion of most techniques in the art are actually very powerful, and you can go test this yourself. Let someone put you in a complete ikkyo and then try to get out of it. It's actually not all that easy. The problem is typically getting to that point. But once you're there, the takedown, the pin, and the submission are all just one technique with almost no extra movement. Think about how the takedown ikkyo is for just a second. Ikkyo is the takedown, and then you do ikkyo to achieve the pin, and more ikkyo gets you the submission. That is pretty unique when you consider that if you do, say, osotogari in judo to someone, now you probably have to fight for position, maybe even guard pass to get a pin and then fight for a submission. In aikido, that is all compactly packaged into one technique. So while there is this stuff that is pretty difficult to get into, if you actually do get to that end phase, you are in a very commanding position. The other thing that I've noticed, and this is probably the more important of the two conclusions, is that we might be measuring the usefulness of aikido with the wrong metrics. Modern martial arts culture is driven by competitive victory, and therefore the most valued techniques tend to be the ones that lead to conclusive bout-ending scenarios: the knockout punch or kick, the big takedown, the submission, the pin. Primarily speaking, these are the things people want to learn and spend time on because they are very clearly related to competitive success, and that makes sense. But I don't actually think the value of aikido lies in any of those things, and that is one of the big reasons it's fallen through the cracks in terms of popular analysis. If someone asked me what aikido is, I would nowadays probably tell them that it's hand fighting taken to its logical extreme. Let me explain. Earlier, I mentioned I do a sneaky nikkyo sometimes using my own lapel. I described this variation as kind of gimmicky, which is something I do stand by. I usually only get it to work once on a person, maybe twice if they get really lazy. I think for most people, they would look at that and assume that the value of the technique has ended after I get a submission. Here is the thing, though. After I snap that technique onto someone, every single time I touch my lapel, they loosen or completely abandon their grip because they're afraid that it's about to come on. If you're not gripping my lapel in a judo setting, then I'm free to advance my gripping position, which is going to set me up for a big throw. Another similar situation is that I like to use kotegaeshi. When people start resisting, they often pull away, which opens up an opportunity for me to advance my gripping position, or sometimes people even resist so much that I can swim an underhook. Also, for what it's worth, a hand that is running away from one of these joint locks also isn't blocking anything, which in a striking situation could mean an opening for a big elbow or something. I think a lot of the locks and the threats of the locks leave a lot of openings for strikers, and this is why I actually think in some ways striking pairs better with aikido than more proper grappling arts do. Now, of course, if people just let you tap them out or throw them down or pin them, that's great. But that is usually the rarer, more extreme outcome of these techniques in my experience. I think even in Aikido itself, we mischaracterize a lot of this stuff as takedowns or joint breaks, and they could be, but hand fighting is really half of what grappling is. I think a lot of these traditional systems deliberately spend a lot of time on it because they know that hand fighting is the positional war that leads to a takedown. Although I will admit it's basically impossible to convince beginner martial artists to spend time on things like hand fighting, grip fighting, traffic control, clinch, because most of the time it's not very sexy. This is not the kind of stuff they are seeing on Instagram. It's not the kind of stuff they're seeing on YouTube. It's not the kind of stuff they are seeing in the octagon. There isn't a lot of interest in these soft secondary skills among beginners, but make no mistake, they are very important. Again, in my estimation, this is about half of what stand-up grappling is. To put it into judo terms, and this is just how I think of it, good footwork plus good hand fighting with just a bit of subterfuge is how you create kuzushi, which then leads to a good takedown. My personal feeling is that we need to stop assuming that takedowns, pins, and submissions are necessarily the main benefit of Aikido. I don't think that's the case. I think Aikido is an art that is very specifically designed to build up softer skills, and therefore it does correlate less with what you would see in a competition, but that doesn't mean that it has nothing to offer competitive athletes. I think we just need to innovate and bring Aikido a little bit more into the modern era. But again, we need way more eyes on the art to do that, which I think we are very far from achieving. To address the title of this video directly, I don't really think these techniques are currently too dangerous for competition. Maybe one day they could be, but whether it be the average level of practitioners or something implicit to the techniques themselves, I can't envision a near future scenario where suddenly people's wrists start getting demolished miraculously. The flip side of that, though, is that I think far too people are actually studying this stuff in depth or giving it much out of the box thought. I think on the outside there is a cult of people who dismiss every technique out of hand because popular culture is, of course, never wrong. And then on the inside of Aikido there is another cult of people who really don't want things to change for a whole variety of reasons on a spectrum from relatively sane to absolute batshit crazy. The art is kind of stuck in the middle of a sandwich of stupid. Despite dumping as much time as I do into this art, and as I have, and as I will continue to do, I remain unconvinced at the current date that somehow this is secretly the best art ever, or even that these techniques will one day stand on equal footing with, say, the judo or wrestling fundamental curriculum. I strongly believe that this is very unlikely. However, I do believe that there is so much room for these techniques to enhance grapplers and strikers alike. Even if you just do this stuff to goof around on the side, the proverbial riddle of trying to solve, and I'm using air quotes on these words, these problems have made me such a more thorough and creative martial artist over the last half decade. I went from someone who just kind of copied and pasted stuff from my teachers and senior students to someone who suddenly has a cork board filled with red strings, and I'm chasing down every lead, every possibility, experimenting with stuff I never would have otherwise. So I'm never going to regret the journey until now, nor the journey yet to come. Aikido, and arts like it, I think have a long way to go. I don't have any delusions about that. My big ask to the audience, though, is that in spite of popular opinion, and in spite of Aikido orthodoxy factionalism, play with this stuff. Goof around with it. Post your ideas, your speculations, your tests, and your discoveries. I really do think that these sorts of exercises, both martially and intellectually, are kind of the unspoken dark arts. Their presence is understated, often misunderstood even, but really understanding subtle things like body mechanics, hand fighting, solid footwork, these are the things that make advanced martial artists advanced. All the stuff is in Aikido that needs to be there. It just needs to be brought out of the 1930s and 40s and into the 2020s. Or disagree with me and dislike this video. That's cool too. Thanks for the algorithm engagement points. Love it or hate it. Thank you so much for listening until the end, and I will catch you all in the next one. Peace. But Tengu, everyone knows that O-sensei, the founder, was the only one doing real Aikido. There hasn't been anyone doing it since. We have to preserve his techniques. If you change things, then we're not even doing Aikido anymore. What do you say to that? Yeah, my official opinion on that is,
Cage. I read about did you say want